When they closed the shutters around Boone's bed, no one in that room thought they were about to hear the remains of a buried historical problem. They thought they were listening to a sick old laborer drift in and out of fever. What survives from that night is small, smaller than stories like this usually want to admit. No signed confession, no newspaper interview, no clean statement in Boone's own hand. Just a narrow chain of residue, an infirmary card, a few inconsistent local references, and a later retelling from someone who had been in the room when the old man started talking about a tree no one else wanted to name carefully. The infirmary card is the first fixed point. Winter 1907. A Catholic infirmary outside Reading. Male patient, late 60s, possibly older. Timber labor history, fever, respiratory distress, periods of agitation. On the reverse side, in a different hand, beneath the treatment notation, 5 words were added almost as an afterthought. Keeps repeating account of tree. By itself that proves almost nothing, but it is enough to move the story out of pure folklore. The man attached to that note is usually identified later as Elias Boone, sometimes Eli Boone, sometimes only Boone. The county traces are uneven. One payroll fragment from the 1890s lists an E. Boone on a crew doing timber and survey support. A later local recollection mentions an older camp hand who would go silent whenever certain valleys were discussed. None of that is decisive. Names blur, records thin out. Memory makes rough men sound stranger than they were. Still, the fragments begin circling the same claim. Not that Boone once saw an enormous tree, that he cut down the last one. The phrase does not appear on the infirmary card. It enters later, through retelling. That means it has to be handled carefully. But the structure of the story around it is stronger than the phrase itself. Across the versions that survive, Boone does not sound like a man trying to hand down a legend. He sounds irritated, corrective, as though he had spent years hearing the thing reduced in the wrong direction. He seems to have kept returning to one point. The story was not made false by being exaggerated. It was made false by being made smaller. That complaint shows up in different language, but it stays intact. The later account says Boone asked for the room to be cleared except for 4 people: a priest, a doctor, one former camp hand, and the woman tending the lamp. That detail may have sharpened in retelling. The tone is more trustworthy than the staging. Boone apparently did not begin with grand claims. He began with corrections. They had not been assigned to that basin. The ground changed before the men saw anything. There were other forms there, not just the standing trunk. And after the first cut, men arrived who started changing the words around the site. That comes later. At the start, his account stays physical. The crew drifted off the marked line because the terrain stopped matching the sheet they were carrying. The creek bent wrong. The timber thinned too fast. The sound changed. Boone seems to have repeated that part more than once. Silence first, then the basin. Not a clearing in the ordinary sense, more like a lowered space with dark soil, pale mineral streaks, and broad rises pushing out of the ground at intervals that felt too regular to ignore. Boone did not seem to explain those rises. He just remembered that the men noticed them before they understood what stood ahead. Then the fog shifted. What they first took for part of the land resolved into a trunk. The later versions all start competing with each other there. Heights grow, widths become theatrical. The more reliable core is simpler and far more effective. The object was isolated. The visible base was wider than anything the crew had worked before. The surface did not read as ordinary bark. It looked plated in places, ridged, split, scarred high above reach. There was no easy category ready for it. That seems to be what stayed with Boone. Not the size by itself, but the pause before the men could even decide what they were looking at. One of the better fragments says they only understood the scale when somebody noticed a dead snag standing near the base. A full tree, reduced by comparison to something almost decorative. Another says the foreman gave an order and had to repeat it because no one moved. Those details feel right. Awkward enough to be memory. The dramatic versions say Boone called it a witness to another world. I doubt he started there. The harder, more believable version is smaller. He was trying to correct the object before anyone corrected its meaning. Not the tallest tree, not a camp story, not something that fit inside the word large. And, according to the same late retelling, the moment his voice sharpened was not when he described seeing it. It was when he described what happened after steel entered the trunk. Boone did not seem to tell the basin in a straight line. He kept coming back to the approach, as if the place had gone wrong in layers. The crew had a marked cut line and a sheet that should have been enough to keep them inside familiar ground. Instead, the terrain began slipping away from the page. The creek turned where Boone thought it should have held straight. The timber fell off too quickly. Fir and cedar thinned into scattered trunks, then brush, then a stretch of ground that looked used up in some older way. Not barren, stripped. What stayed with him most was the silence. Not theatrical silence, not the sort that announces itself in a story. The practical kind men notice because a forest usually answers their movement. Branch noise overhead, birds breaking, insects lifting from the ground. According to Boone's account, those things had already dropped away before the crew understood they were entering a basin. Then came the footing. Dark soil, pale mineral streaks, harder patches under the boots where the ground felt less like root web and more like exposed substrate. One later recollection says a younger hand thought they had crossed old burn land. That may be someone else improving the scene years later. The stronger detail is Boone's own emphasis that the forest floor stopped behaving like forest floor. The broad rises came next, several of them, circular or near circular, low against the basin floor but too even in outline to pass without notice. The men saw them before their attention fixed on the central object. Boone never explains them cleanly in any version I trust. He just keeps them in the frame, unresolved, as part of what made the place feel wrong before the trunk itself came fully into view. That restraint helps the story. If Boone had wanted only to impress, he could have rushed the crew straight to the impossible tree. Instead, the scene builds the way field memory usually builds: sound, footing, spacing, then scale. At first, at least one man took the thing ahead for a wall or a cliff face, holding in the fog. That detail survives across more than one retelling, and it makes sense. The eye will always choose the familiar object first if the proportions are too far outside expectation. Only when one of the crew pointed out the standing snag near the base did the scale settle properly. A dead tree, perhaps 80 feet or so, turned into a marker so small it made the men stop walking. Boone seems to have remembered the delay more clearly than the awe. No one knew what to call it. The visible base spread too wide. The surface looked wrong, not soft bark, not clean stone. Ridged, plated, dark in the main mass, lighter where scars and seams broke through. Damage or splitting ran high above reach. The upper extent could not be fixed. Fog and hanging haze swallowed too much of it. The foreman tried to bring the scene back into work. That part is easy to believe. Men with no category reach for procedure. Rope, estimate, comparison, orders. Boone said they measured what they could. The first circumference estimate was doubted and done again. Height could not be settled. The upper portion stayed obscured. That is enough. The numbers are less important than the fact that the usual tools of timber work did not calm the object down. There is a later administrative description tied to the same general region that treats the place as mixed difficult ground with mineralized standing material and poor extraction value. On paper, that explanation works well enough. Crews do enter bad country. Mineralized remnants exist. Men misread what they are not trained to classify. But Boone's remembered account does not sharpen into fantasy at the crucial point. It sharpens into matter. He does not say the basin revealed its meaning there and then. He says the first real break came when the foreman ordered the surface tested and the steel answered back in the wrong way. That is where the story stops being only visual. That is where it becomes physical. The first thing Boone seems to have trusted in his own memory was the sound. He said the blade did not come back with wood in it. That line survives because it is plain. Not a grand claim. Not a deathbed flourish. Just the kind of correction a laboring man would make if everyone around him kept picturing the wrong material. The crew struck the outer layer expecting unusual resistance, maybe density, maybe age. What they got was worse because it was inconsistent. Not the wet give of living timber, not the dry split of old-standing deadwood either. The outer surface threw back something harder, tighter, with a mineral edge in the sound. Boone seems to have repeated that the steel told them what the eye had not yet managed to settle. Whatever stood in that basin was not behaving like ordinary wood. The foreman ordered more strikes. Small fragments came away. They did not agree with each other. Some were dark and fibrous, dense enough to feel wrong in the hand. Others broke off thin and brittle, more like flaked mineralized bark than fresh timber. One later recollection says a man ground a fragment under his boot and got less splintering than he expected. Whether that detail is exact or not, it fits the broader impression Boone left. The outer shell seemed layered, as if it had passed through more than one condition without ever becoming one thing completely. That is what slowed the cut. The men were no longer simply felling a trunk. They were stopping to look at what the steel exposed between blows. At first it was only transitions. Density changes, dark bands, uneven color. Then the inner patterning emerged. Rings, if that is still the best word for them, though Boone seems never to have trusted the word fully after the fact. Concentric structure was there, but broken, interrupted by voids and seams that did not behave like familiar growth damage. The pattern looked organic and disturbed at the same time. Later versions get melodramatic too quickly, talking about rooms and hidden passages. Boone's own remembered account is more restrained and therefore stronger. He described openings, empty spaces where solid mass should have resisted. One crewman reached into one and withdrew his hand quickly. Boone either would not or could not say exactly what caused the reaction. He only kept the openings in the story as a fact the men had not expected. There was a smell too. Not fresh sap, not clean rot. Something older and sharper, the smell of a sealed interior broken open after too long under pressure. That is the kind of detail people remember badly and truthfully at the same time. They struggle to label it because no comparison feels right. Then the cut reached the black seam. This may be the strongest point where Boone's remembered account and the surviving paperwork begin to touch each other. In the oral version, the seam ran across the exposed face too cleanly to look like ordinary fire scarring. The men thought char at first, then they saw it held differently, compacted, darker, carrying hard inclusions that stood out in the cut. One of the crew used a blade point to pry something small and bright from the seam wall. Later tellings start guessing what it was. Metal, bone, glass. None of those labels help much now. The useful point is smaller. A distinct fragment came out of the seam, and it drew immediate attention. On the paper side, a damaged camp inventory line tied to a timber operation in the same region and period notes 3 wrapped samples transferred after a delay caused by dense black seam/mineral content uncertain. In the cleaner summary copy, the wording broadens into a generic materials notation. The seam is no longer named. That discrepancy does not prove a cover-up by itself. What it does is keep Boone's account from floating free of the record entirely. At the site, according to the remembered version, this was the moment the mood changed. Measurements stopped being called out casually. Fragments were not left near the cut. Material from the seam was handled separately. One man was told not to enter a detail into the ordinary tally notes until the survey side had seen it. Whether those were the exact words or not, the divide had opened. What the crew had struck and what would later be safely written down were already separating into different layers. Boone does not yet sound like a man building a theory. He sounds like a man who never got over the material sequence. Wrong sound, wrong texture. Openings inside the trunk, a dark seam that produced separately handled samples. By then the object in the basin was no longer just difficult timber. And before the crew had enough time to decide for themselves what that meant, other men began arriving to decide which parts of it would count. The later retellings make the arrivals dramatic. Too dramatic, usually. A company man in clean boots. A surveyor with instruments. Someone too well dressed for camp, taking notes while the laborers stood back. Some version of that may be true. What matters more is the shift in behavior that follows. That part feels steadier than the staging. Boone seems to have remembered the basin changing hands. Fewer men were allowed near the cut. Fragments were gathered instead of passed around. Measurements stopped being spoken in the open way working crews use when they still think a site belongs to them. The foreman, who had been running the cut, started deferring. That is the important change. By then, Boone's own words thin out and the record cools down. The story moves from labor memory into administrative language, and the language immediately becomes safer. In the remembered account, Boone stayed angry about that longer than anything else. He did not seem obsessed with proving a giant tree to the world. He was fixated on the way the object was renamed once other men took control of the site. Timber language gave way to geological language. The standing object drifted toward specimen, then formation. The basin became irregular ground. The seam became mineral content. The whole place began sliding away from the words the crew would have used on the day they first struck it. The paper residue supports at least part of that. The strongest example is the field sheet discrepancy. An earlier version associated with the operation marks the central area with wording closest to standing timber/access uncertain. The creek line bends nearer to the basin. The approach route is still legible as a rote. In the later cleaned copy, the same area is generalized. The central notation shifts toward mineral obstruction. The access line becomes less distinct. The basin is no longer framed around a singular object, but around difficult ground. That is not sensational by itself. Clean copies simplify. Survey language standardizes. Ambiguous sites get recoded after inspection. None of that is unusual. What makes it worth holding is the convergence. Boone spent his final account trying to correct a reduction, and the record that survives around the site appears to show exactly that kind of reduction happening on paper. This is where the official explanation deserves to stand in full. Mixed ground. Mineralized standing material. An extraction site judged commercially poor after closer inspection. No reason to preserve unstable field language from laborers who were already outside the intended cut. No reason to circulate dramatic site descriptions if a safer geological frame handled the paperwork more cleanly. That explanation is coherent. It also leaves small scraps behind. The cleaned field copy is calmer than the raw one. The inventory summary is broader than the damaged seam note. The oral account grows more dramatic over time, but its central complaint stays fixed. The thing at the center of the basin was not denied outright. It was reduced, recoded, made easier to carry in ordinary language. Boone appears to have noticed that instinctively, even if he never formalized it. He seems to have watched the first description get replaced. That may be the real threshold in the story. Not discovery. Replacement. By then, the basin contains 5 solid points that continue to hold together even after the exaggerations are stripped off. A crew off the assigned line, ground that stopped reading normally, an object too large and too materially strange to settle quickly, a black seam with separately handled samples, and a paper trail that gets cleaner precisely where the site becomes harder to describe plainly. After that, the story starts leaning beyond itself, not into certainty, into comparison, because once the object in the basin is translated into safer terms, the obvious question is no longer just what it was. It is what it was being kept from resembling. For years, Boone seems to have kept the story inside a narrow frame. Not a lost civilization, not a hidden map of the world. Just a basin, a cut, a black seam, and the feeling that the object at the center of it had been described differently after other men arrived. That may be the most believable thing about him. A dying laborer does not usually reach first for a total theory. He returns to the part that stayed in his hands, the sound of the blade, the wrong texture under steel, the change in the foreman's voice, the way a place stops belonging to the men who found it. And still, once the fragments are laid side by side, the story begins to lean beyond itself. The infirmary note remains plain and dry. Fever, respiratory distress, agitation, repeated account of tree. The later retellings are more unstable, but not useless. They preserve Boone's irritation, his habit of correcting smaller words, his insistence that what stood in that basin was not being remembered in the right category. The paper trail, thin as it is, does something similar in colder language. A line about a dense black seam, wrapped samples, then the cleaner copy with less to hold onto. Mineral obstruction, general materials, uncertain ground. It is not the sort of evidence that announces itself. It accumulates quietly. The more I sat with it, the less the story felt like a single bizarre incident, and the more it felt like a familiar kind of reduction. A thing first encountered physically, awkwardly, by men who have no polished vocabulary for it, then later processed into terms broad enough to make comparison difficult. In Boone's case, the shift seems to have happened almost immediately. In the raw layer of the story, the object is still timber, however wrong it feels. It has a surface, a cut, rings, a seam, openings where solid mass should be. In the later administrative layer, it drifts toward geology. Formation, mineral content, extraction problem, access issue. That shift does not prove deception. Institutions do this constantly. They stabilize what they can. They choose the category that behaves best on paper. But once you notice it here, it becomes harder not to notice it elsewhere. Old survey language has a different texture from cleaned summaries. Early descriptions often sound clumsy in exactly the way first contact usually sounds. Too visual, too physical, too uncertain. Then later copies arrive with their sharper nouns and safer boundaries. A rise becomes an outcrop. A buried level becomes a basement. A structural oddity becomes settlement, subsidence, repair. Sometimes those later terms are right. Sometimes they may still leave something behind. That is where Boone's basin begins to point outward. Not because it solves anything on its own, but because the central image refuses to stay local. A crew enters ground that stops reading like ordinary forest. Circular rises sit around a standing object too large to classify quickly. The first cut exposes mixed material. A dark seam produces separately handled samples. Then the site is rewritten in a language that lowers the temperature of the whole thing. Even stripped of legend, that sequence has weight. There is another detail in Boone's remembered account that stays with me. He does not seem to have described the basin as containing one impossible object in otherwise normal terrain. He describes a central trunk and other forms around it that the men noticed before they understood what they were looking at. Broad rises, repeated shape, wrong spacing. He never explains them, at least not in any version I trust. But he did not forget them either. That restraint matters. Had he wanted only to impress, he could have made the whole valley miraculous. Instead, he leaves it partially unresolved. A thing seen, not interpreted fully. That gives the rest of the story its pressure. The object in the basin may have been unique. It may also have belonged to a class of things the crew did not have names for, and the later paperwork had no incentive to preserve in unstable terms. By then Boone was old, and the story had already begun splitting in two. On one side, the manageable version, difficult ground, mineralized standing material, non-viable timber. On the other, the version people tell after drink, where every number grows and every edge becomes myth. What disappears between them is the useful middle, the first description before it hardens, the uncertain language of men who are still trying to say what their tools and eyes gave them. That may be the real reason Boone kept talking. Not to hand down a grand explanation, but to keep that middle layer alive a little longer. Because once it goes, the object goes with it. All that remains is paperwork on one side, folklore on the other, and the basin itself, if it is still there, under whatever name survived. By the last night, Boone was no longer telling the story in order. He was pulling at it. That is the shape the infirmary retelling leaves behind once the ornament is stripped away. Not a man delivering a polished revelation. A man short of breath, circling back, correcting words, trying to stop one part of the account from hardening into the wrong version after he was gone. The room did some of the work for him. That is why the final piece has to stay narrow. He returned to the inside of the trunk, not its height, not its fame. The interior, what lay beyond the first exposed cut. This is where later retellings grow greedy. Rooms, ladders, hidden chambers. Those details do not help. The older fragments are smaller and better. Boone seems to have been trying to describe an inner surface that curved inward and then opened. A change in finish. A place where the wall no longer looked broken in the ordinary sense. One attendant later said he kept drawing the same shape in the air with his hand, then stopping as if the movement alone could not hold it. He also returned to the markings. Not as writing, at least not confidently. The stronger version is rougher than that. Repeated marks, grouped, too regular to ignore, set inside, not outside. Enough to make at least one man near the cut stop, treating the opening as simple damage. That point survives even after everything ornate is stripped away. There is one revealing moment in the infirmary retelling. Someone in the room used the word carved. Boone objected. He was too weak by then to explain the distinction properly, but he still rejected the word. Carved was too neat, too external. What he was trying to describe seems to have belonged to the surface itself, not to something laid over it later. Then the story narrows further. A phrase keeps surfacing in the later account, and even if the wording is not exact, the pressure behind it feels real. The men who arrived after the seam was opened were not most disturbed by the size of the object. They were disturbed by the interior. That is as far as I would push it. Not a solved mystery, not proof of a hidden civilization in one basin. Just an interior that changed the mood of everyone around it, including men who had not been there for the first blows. Boone noticed access tightening. He noticed language changing. He noticed that the part of the cut which mattered most to the crew became the part most quickly covered, translated and thinned out in the record. The rest of his last account comes in fragments. The wrong map survived. The thing had grown. It had rings. They cut it. Then they changed the words. That is close enough to a final correction that it should be left alone. It sounds like the most credible version of Boone still available to us. Not a theorist at the edge of death, but a laboring witness who never forgot the point where physical contact gave way to administrative language. And that is where the story closes best. The basin may have held a mineralized tree of unusual scale. It may have held something stranger. The later retellings almost certainly preserve too much. The record almost certainly preserves too little. But Boone's complaint survives the distortion intact. What stood in that basin was first encountered by men with axes, rope, and no useful category for what they had in front of them. Afterward, other men arrived with cleaner words, and whatever the object had been before that, it became smaller from then on. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. And tell me this in the comments. When history encounters an object that does not fit cleanly into one category, what usually gets lost first? The evidence itself, or the language that once described it honestly?